Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
You are indeed here on Breakthrough News, and you are watching the Freedom Side here. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, or at least most of the time, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back with you.
It's great to be back on with you, Eugene Perrier, most of the time.
Well, listen, regular viewers know that sometimes, things are happening. We're moving around. You're reporting live on the ground from Caracas, different things like that. So, it's a nod to those who watch every week.
Mm-hmm. Always a nod to those who watch everything. Today, I've got two mugs. I've got my coffee mug and my water mug, which I think is really funny. I just wanted to, so there's just going to be different mugs happening.
Well, listen, I think that people in the audience will be very happy. It'll help them, I don't even know. In the age of social media, everyone's looking for constant, mental stimulation. Yeah. So seeing you work multiple mugs, it'll probably help.
I also have this water bottle, by the way. I've got so many. Wow.
Your liquids are ready to go.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned now, considering all the different things that should not be next to liquid. So anyways, let's see how that goes. I got to do it every episode. We got to start off in a different way. And so today my way is to let our audience know that there are lots of liquids surrounding my mixer and my computer and my keyboard. And so let's just hope that nothing that shouldn't come into contact with one another comes into contact with each other.
Well, if you short out at some point during the show and we lose you, everyone will know what happened. There was a spill.
We know what happened. Exactly.
Well, Rania, before we get started here today, since you've mentioned mugs and there's various different things, I thought I would ask you if there are important things you feel our viewers should know prior to the start of the show itself.
Always, yes. I feel it's very important for our viewers to know that obviously we are an independent media outlet and we are able to sustain ourselves and grow with your support. And you can support our programs here at Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can become a member. You can get access to exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, such as this very cool mug, one of the many things I'm, drinking various liquids out of this evening. And on top of that, I just want to also let you know that you can make a one-time donation in the live chat, or you can go to breakthroughnews.org and make a one-time donation there. But most importantly, if you are able to, please do become a member of Breakthrough News, because, we're not CNN. We don't have an unlimited war chest to beat the drums for war, as many mainstream media outlets do. Independent media is more important than ever. So if you are able to, please become a part of the movement and help us sustain ourselves and grow.
Yes, no, absolutely. We would appreciate all your support. And big shout out to everybody who is watching now, who is already a patron. Certainly all of your support has been absolutely critical for us being able to do everything that we have done so far. And from, as I mentioned earlier, you reporting live there in the Venezuelan elections, to being on the streets during the Democratic National Convention, to bringing you shows like this, Dispatches with Rania Khalek, all the great things that we are doing here, and much, much more that will be coming to you in the coming months. So shout out to all your support. And if you are not yet supporting, now is your opportunity to get in on the game. But we got a great show for you here this week, as we always do, and we want to just jump right into it. And one of the major issues, I guess I keep, maybe I was foreshadowing this here in my introduction, Rania, is the ongoing saga, I guess you could call it, as it concerns the outcome of the elections in Venezuela. There have been a number of important happenings that have taken place over the past several weeks, and we want to get into all of that, what it means, and perhaps some of what we can look for in the future. And as always, we are very, very honored to be joined by Zoe Alexandra, who is a journalist and editor of People's Dispatch, who also was there on the ground during the Venezuelan elections, several weeks ago. Zoe, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you as always. A lot of things are happening around the elections, and I guess we'll sort of get into it all. But I think the most important factor that I was hoping you could talk about is the Venezuelan Supreme Court, which was asked by President Nicolas Maduro and various other opposition figures to adjudicate the dispute over the outcome, has rendered their ruling about what took place. What have they said, Zoe, and what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, this was a much expected ruling from the Venezuelan Supreme Court. As we know, in the days and week following this democratic process, as the opposition began to kind of ramp up their campaign in saying that fraud had taken place and all of the other things that we've covered here at People's Dispatch, and I know you've covered also on Breakthrough News, Nicolas Maduro came out and said, okay, if you're alleging there's fraud, why don't we bring this to the competent institutions? It's not, the competent institution is not international corporate media who can say, okay, if the opposition says there's fraud, and that's how the decision gets made. Actually, he said, in order for this to have a peaceful and democratic resolution, we must turn to the institutions in our country to resolve this matter. And so he said that his party, PSUV, was going to bring, all of their electoral tallies that they collected on the day of the elections, and called on all the other parties to do the same. And so the Supreme Court kind of accepted this petition from Maduro and, had called on all the parties' representatives and the candidates to appear before the Supreme Court to present the famous tallies, which essentially every single party would collect on election day, in addition to the National Electoral Council. And so that happened again in the beginning of August. And they rendered their ruling last week to say that after reviewing all of the tallies of the different parties, that it confirms the results that were released by the CNE, which said that Maduro had won with 51% of the votes. And this is, really important because, again, if the opposition is alleging that with their tallies that fraud was committed and that Edmundo Gonzalez won with 70% of the vote, the Supreme Court basically just said, we actually reviewed the tallies of 8 parties and electoral alliances, and they say the exact same thing as the Electoral Council said, and that is that Maduro won the vote with 51%. So, it should be a case closed kind of situation. Different concerns were raised. The competent bodies did the checks that they needed to do, and there is sort of this resolution, which, most sectors of society said, okay, yeah, that sounds about right. On to the next thing. On to actually continuing to build the country and continuing with rebuilding the economy. But of course, we know that the U.S. has not really recognized this, and neither has the opposition.
Zoe, can you speak a bit about the neighboring countries? Because a lot has taken place, and some surprises, especially given the way that Brazil's leader and Colombia's leader have behaved in response to the U.S. alleging this election fraud and recognizing this opposition leader that did not win. Mexico's also taken a certain stance. Can you talk a bit about how things have played out regionally with these particular countries, as well as what's happened throughout through the OAS?
Definitely. So I just wanted to start by saying that Laura Richardson, the general of the U.S. Southern Command, which is the Southern Command of the U.S. Army, one of the many different kind of sections that it has, is currently in Chile for this huge kind of like army conference with generals from the region. And she said yesterday, while in Chile, that, Venezuela's election was a clear example of how democracy is being undermined across the world. And it's funny because obviously she's saying this from Chile, a U.S. Army official. The irony is kind of overflowing in that sense. But it's important to point out, to start here, because we've seen Gabriel Boric really, really come down hard. And this isn't that much of a surprise in a sense. He was considered to be a sort of progressive leader. He comes out of the student movement. But, you know, in terms of geopolitics, we've seen him have really strong alignment with Ukraine, for example. He's been kind of like the one Latin American leader who's really rallied behind US and NATO war efforts, having a lot of meetings with Vladimir Zelensky, and constantly reiterating Ukraine's right to self-defense. And unsurprisingly, he has been sort of the fresh new face on the front line of attack against Venezuela. You know, even there was a leak conversation that came out that even before the elections took place, that there was sort of direction and orientation for people to ask about these electoral tallies, indicating that this was going to be the path that they would take in mainstream media to talk about the illegitimacy of the electoral process. So Chile has been one of the countries that's really turned its back on Venezuela and has been kind of rallying other countries to do the same. Argentina, again, we've talked about Milei a lot of times. There's really no surprise there. His whole libertarianism, fight against communism, fight against leftism, really part and parcel of his whole charade. But it's interesting because at the same time that Milei is rallying against Venezuela, his country has 75% rate of poverty, 65% of children in poverty in his country. So perhaps he should be more concerned with his own country than what's happening in Venezuela. And what you mentioned, Rania, there is, you know, there was this sort of centrist bloc in a sense that was trying to say, okay, let's wait to see what the competent Venezuelan institutions say. We're not going to recognize neither the victory of Edmundo Gonzalez nor the victory of Maduro. We're going to wait and see. This sort of bloc was led by Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, Lula, Petro, AMLO. And we did see a sort of kind of deviation or perhaps a new path charted by Petro and Lula, who were saying that, well, you know, it seems a little difficult. It seems like maybe there's no possibility for Venezuelans to actually resolve Venezuelans' problems, and that there should be new elections. Maybe there should be a government of cohabitation, which would essentially mean PSUV ruling with the far-right opposition, which is completely unheard of. These positions were presented in sort of informal settings, in radio interviews, on social media. Many people were shocked by this, but again, it's sort of their attempt to mediate and come on the world stage as the people who are like solving problems. But again, you know, completely undermining Venezuela's institutions. But in that vein, Mexico has actually maintained its position. And I think that with the Supreme Court ruling, notably there's been a little bit less in the news of these leaders trying to kind of instigate. And I think we're going to see in the coming weeks that as things have already calmed down in Venezuela, as we're not seeing any sort of attempts to sort of create violent protests, all of that has really died down. The opposition, in a sense, has really been defeated on the streets. I think we're also going to see, hopefully, an international kind of corporate media that they also realize that this is a lost cause and that, you know, at the end of the day, the Venezuelan people spoke and they voted for Maduro. It was a, very close election. 51% is not a landslide, but it is a victory. And so we'll see where that goes in the coming days.
Into here and a lot to be said, and not to leave it unsaid that Gabriel Boric had no problem recognizing the coup government in Peru right away. But that's, I guess, a whole other question. But I do want to ask you, Zoe, because one of the issues that I think has become most discussed here is around maybe the essence of what democracy really means. And we recently saw in the past several days, the National Popular Consultation, another form of electoral process there rooted in the commune movement of Venezuela. And I think this is, its own part of the discourse as it concerns what democracy really means and how it's being framed vis-a-vis the elections.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, since the Bolivarian Revolution began with Chavez winning the presidential elections in 1998, I think there's been over 30 electoral processes, and this includes referendums, popular consultations, presidential elections, legislative elections, all sorts of things. So, on one hand, when we're thinking about democracy and what is going to the polls, the Venezuelan people have been actively going to the polls, participating in this one form of democracy, which is, casting your vote. And so, Venezuela really excels at actually putting in the resources to have this form of directly hearing people's opinions, people's desires on how the country should move forward. But Venezuelan and Bolivarian democracy is far from limited to electoral processes. And so what you were referencing there, Eugene, of the National Popular Consultation is a process that began, the first one took place in April of this year. And, it's people, it's working class people who are organized in different communal circuits and different communal councils, carrying out a very lengthy process before heading to the polls, which involves consulting in the community, having different series of meetings and assemblies, and identifying what are the key needs, material needs of the community, where would they like government resources to go. So if you're from most countries in the world, you know that, for example, you might have potholes in your neighborhood, you might have problems with sewers, many different infrastructural problems. And oftentimes there's really no avenue for you to actually demand that the government deal with those, invest resources into bettering them. Maybe it's a common belief amongst the community that there's a real need for, a children's after school center or different sorts of things that would benefit the community. And what this popular communal consultation is actually giving people the ability to not only come up with those proposals amongst their community, but then actually to vote on which project do they want to be funded by the state and actually getting that funding and taking that forward. So, I think the Bolivarian project and the Bolivarian democracy really expands and redefines what democracy means in the 21st century. I think in most countries in the world, we're seeing the erosion of democracy. We're seeing the erosion of this grand idea of liberal bourgeois democracy. In the US, third-party candidates aren't even able to get on the ballot without a huge legal fight. Whereas in Venezuela, there's dozens of parties and people are participating in creating a new form of democracy, but also really bringing their voice and their concerns to people in power and actually being able to kind of distribute not only resources, but power back into communities.
Mm-hmm. No, well, extremely interesting process. And thankfully, we have outlets like People's Dispatch who have been covering all of the details of everything happening with the presidential election and national popular consultation and just about everything else in Venezuela and seemingly every country on earth. So make sure that is in your browser. Zoe Alexandra, you are the editor of People's Dispatch. And as always, we really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, I mean, it's just so unbelievable how uncreative the American government is, because it really is just the same script over and over again. I mean, the only difference this time is that his name is something that's not Juan Guaido. Yeah. But geez, they really it's not that original. I mean, sorry, I don't mean to make jokes about something that is a very serious issue and obviously causes a lot of damage to the lives of millions and millions of Venezuelans, and more importantly, also regionally. But it really is just stunning how they can just really replay the same thing over and over again, and I guess see if it sticks.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is amazing. And I mean, such a long history. I don't even know why I was thinking about this the other day, but I mean, the 1988 Mexican elections, stolen because of a progressive government. You can say many different aspects about a number of elections in the 90s and how that played out. The 2006 Mexican elections, the 2009 coup against Manuel Zelaya in Honduras. I mean, the anti-democratic elements of this, the dirty war waged against Jamaica in the 1970s. I mean, it really is, I think one of the maybe I don't know if it's unknown now. I guess a lot of it is known. But, one of the things I feel needs to at least be ruminated on more is how much the U.S., how much time, money, energy, resources, military force, whatever has been invested in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean to make sure that people don't have, any form of self-determination. It's quite a statement. But, Rania, brings us... Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing to that is the other aspect of this that really just gets me is, I think the U.S. media, the corporate media, as well as U.S. government officials have demonstrated their capacity for pathological lies throughout this genocide in Gaza, to the point where you should not believe anything they say about any adversary country just on the fact that they say it or that the New York Times reports it. And what gets me is that there still seems to be this disconnect for some people between the idea that the U.S. can lie about Gaza, but somehow we're supposed to just believe that they're telling the truth about Venezuela. I mean, you guys, they lie about Gaza because they also lie about Venezuela, because they also lie about China, because they all, and on and on and on and on. I'm not saying that means that, you shouldn't go look into it yourself, but do not believe anything these media outlets and these American officials who are pathologically lying about a genocide tell you about a country like Venezuela.
Well, they're telling a lot of tales about Mexico, too, and it's causing some increased tensions between the United States and Mexico. And thankfully for us, we have Kurt Hackbarth, the writer, journalist with Jacobin Magazine, and also the host of the Soberanía Mexican Politics podcast, here to help us sort through it all. Kurt, as always, thanks so much for being with us. Oh, you might be muted.
Oh, no.
Oh, that'd be bad. Our end. Oh, we got you.
There we go.
Perfect.
There we go. All right.
There it is. Well, Kurt, there's a lot happening, and maybe just to start with some framing here. I mean, people maybe have seen some headlines in the U.S. that there's a controversy over judicial reform in Mexico regarding some of the policies that Claudia Sheinbaum says she will continue to pursue when she ascends to the presidency here, quote unquote, Plan C. It's also called. What are these actual reforms that are taking place that have caused so much back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico?
Yeah, so what's going on now in this transition period between the AMLO administration and the incoming administration of Claudia Sheinbaum is the new Morena Congress is not wasting any time. As we saw on the June 2nd elections, Morena didn't just win. They won a supermajority in both houses of Congress, in both the House of Deputies, Mexico's version of the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And a supermajority in state houses. Mexico has 32 states. It's a federal system like the United States, which means that Morena and its allies can now pass constitutional level reforms on their own without having to consult with the opposition. The opposition had blocked a series of reforms over the previous years before this election. So what Morena did was, AMLO laid out a series of 20 constitutional reforms in February, and he said, we're running on this. This is the Plan C that you mentioned. And that includes a judicial reform to, democratically elect judges. It includes a reform to give indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples greater rights and greater autonomy. It includes reforms to ban fracking at a constitutional level, to ban open pit mining, to peg the minimum wage to inflation, to increase workers' pensions and create a fund so that workers can retire on their last salary up to a certain limit. So it's a series of progressive reforms that AMLO laid out and said, give us the supermajority so that we can pass these. And the public did, even, against, the predictions of most of the pollsters. So, the new Congress is sitting starting September 1st, and they're going to start passing these constitutional level reforms. Now, the one that is getting the most media attention internationally is the judicial reform. So, you have a real push on Morena's part to get this judicial reform going, and you see a lot of blowback from the U.S. press. You see Bloomberg, Mary Anastasio Grady saying, "Oh my God, they're going to do judicial reform. We have to short the peso," right? All kinds of kind of financial coup kind of things. Let's hit the peso hard so that they can't do these reforms, and especially the judicial reform. The kind of the typical sneering from the New York Times saying that Mexico is going to shift, and I'm quoting here, from a judiciary based on an appointment system based on specialized training and qualifications to one where just about anyone can become a judge with a law degree and a few years of experience. Just this sneering elitism just dripping out of the New York Times that, heaven forbid, just about anyone could become, a judge in Mexico, rather than the coterie of elite judges that we have now in Mexico that cater absolutely to corporate interests and the interests of the wealthy, both national and international. And this is what the United States is worried about. They won't have the judiciary in their pocket anymore for multinationals, multinational mining companies, multinational energy companies to get injunctions, to block legislation, to block any kind of progressive reforms that prevent them from doing whatever they want in Mexican territory, basically.
It's really incredible. I mean, it's just so anti-democratic to be attacking this and to try to frame it as something that's like so horrific. When I'm sorry, what's the system that they want supposed to look like? The US system, where a bunch of right-wing crazy judges take over so they can archaically like remove people's rights so we can go back 150 years? I mean, sorry, now I'm opining, but it's just so insane. All that said, can you talk a bit about AMLO's response? Because I think it's a pretty strong response. And, I think for a country like Mexico, it isn't easy to respond in a defensive capacity against such a big country like the US, because Mexico has a lot to lose when it comes to this massive country that'll just try to eat it up if it doesn't abide by exactly what America wants. So what has AMLO's response been? And moreover, what has the public's response been? Because there is a lot of right-wing media that, I don't know, you can elaborate on this, but there is a lot of right-wing media in Mexico that will push the US line on things.
Yeah, the public is overwhelmingly supportive of the judicial reform. From polls up from 70, even up to 80% of the public, support this reform. And it makes sense. If you've ever had to deal with the judiciary in Mexico, from anything to a minor infraction up to, a federal case, you know what's involved with regards to bribes and delays and, cases that can go on for years and years and years. And, just this obscene level of corruption where, wealthy people just go through a revolving door in Mexico. They go in and the judges free them and they're back out, right? With a system which called here the sabadazo, which is the Saturday blow. Judges very frequently let wealthy people off on Saturdays thinking that nobody will be able to do anything until Mondays when they're out the door. Right. And so you a series of former governors and former, politicians accused of the worst things, out the door, out the door, out the door. Right. And you also saw in this administration, the Supreme Court, very much like the U.S. Supreme Court, batting back progressive reforms, one after the other on minor technicalities. You'd never seen the Mexican Supreme Court so active until AMLO and Morena took power. And all of a sudden they're batting everything back. So, for example, in something like the energy reform, which was very important, it was an attempt by Mexico to reassert public control over its energy sector and its electrical grid. The first injunction comes in 6 hours after it's passed, and then another injunction and another injunction. And so they suspend the whole law, right? So this is the way that they're using lawfare to freeze, the entire attempt to remold the country in the courts. Unlike U.S. Democrats, Morena is not sitting on their hands on this, right? The electoral reform provides for a total renovation of the Supreme Court, next year. And now the Supreme Court is going to have to be elected, right? As will all the other federal judges. There'll be term limits on the Supreme Court. There are term limits now, but the term limits will be reduced to 12 years. How nice would it be in the U.S. if Supreme Court judges were limited to 12 years, right? There will now be a disciplinary tribunal that will have the power to punish judges and suspend and even get rid of corrupt judges. Imagine if there were a disciplinary tribunal in the U.S. that could go after Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito for their all expenses paid trips around the world by, Republican donors who have cases before the Supreme Court, right? This is what Mexico's doing. They are creating a people-powered judiciary, which actually has real teeth to go after corrupt judges and not just have to sit on their hands and have 5 judges or 6, be dictators for life, basically. So, in light of all that, U.S. Ambassador Ken Salazar, who actually had come out 2 months ago and had said something very logical. He said, judicial reform is Mexico's business, which it is. It's Mexico's business and nobody else's, right? And even a few days, before his more controversial statement, he'd said, well, I support the judicial reform because in Colorado, where I was attorney general, we have retention elections for judges, right? His own state, and it works fine, and I'm in favor of it. Well, obviously, somebody up above didn't like, Ken kind of going off the cuff like that, and so they put their thumb down on him. So a few days later, Salazar comes out with this very blunt statement saying the exact opposite. That the judicial reform is bad and it's going to undermine judicial independence, as if the judiciary were independent now, and it's basically going to turn Mexico into Iraq or Afghanistan. He really said this. 2 countries the United States invaded and occupied. Those are the examples he used. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that he would use Iraq and Afghanistan as examples of states that don't have an independent judiciary. Why don't those countries have independent judiciaries, right? And then at the end of the letter, here comes the threat, right? Because the U.S. never comes out with anything that doesn't have either a direct or an implicit threat. And the threat is our commercial relationship will be endangered by this, right? This is the key. Right, that's the threat, which you were talking about, Rania. It's very difficult for Mexico to assert its sovereignty in the face of these kinds of threats, right? So the U.S. line is that the U.S., and this is something the Wall Street Journal said very overtly, the U.S. has every right to opine on this because Mexico's judiciary affects what happens to U.S. companies in Mexico. So basically, the free trade agreement means that they can have an opinion on anything and everything, right? So what does AMLO say? He said, very clearly, this is none of your business, right? It's none of your business. And, a couple of days later, he said, and I think you put the video on Breakthrough News, our relationships with the U.S. Embassy are on pause. So basically, butt out, Ken, in so many words. It's a way to kind of thread the needle, right? Because you can't freeze relationships with the United States fully. That would lead to a full-blown diplomatic crisis, whatever else. So he said, basically, we're putting the relationship with the embassy on pause until Salazar and the coterie over there decide to mind their own business. And he did the same thing with the Canadian embassy, which had come out with a similar statement, a little bit weaker. And he was actually quite critical of Canada for following along the U.S.'s lead like some kind of, sad client state. AMLO ate his Wheaties this week. He was really, he's going out with both guns a-blazing here. But, that caused then Salazar to backtrack and said, I didn't really mean all that, although that's what he said. And we respect Mexico's sovereignty, but we're still worried about the judicial reform, and we're open to dialogue about it. And it's like, you still don't get it.
Right.
No dialogue. This is not a dialogue issue, right? International issues are dialogue issues, right? Trade issues are dialogue issues. Our judiciary system is not a dialogue issue. Just imagine if the Mexican ambassador, Esteban Moctezuma, in Washington, put out a 2-page statement criticizing Biden's judicial reform, which, incidentally, has some of the similar, tenets of what Mexico's trying to do. Term limits, an ethics commission, right? It's very similar. Imagine if the Mexican ambassador said, I'm going to come out and have a press conference about it. They would run him out of the country in 5 minutes. But the United States thinks that they can, and their allies in the media, opine on what Mexico does and doesn't do with their own judiciary system. It's, imperialism takes many masks. Sometimes it's, Laura Richardson in Chile, but sometimes it's, the ambassador coming out with stuff like this.
Yeah, it's a crucial point on so many pieces, and I'll just ask you this finally, Kurt. I mean, there's an element of this that I think all of us who followed Latin America for a while have always noted about U.S. policy is there's a fear of a good example element to it. I mean, the way you laid out everything AMLO's doing, I feel like there's so many tens of millions of people who would be like, that sounds totally legitimate. Totally fantastic. You can look at facts like, whatever we could critique him for, the fact that Bernie Sanders, dominated on the border in Colorado and California and Nevada and all these other places that, to some degree, the U.S., I'm sure, is very concerned about a range of different issues in controlling Mexico's economy. But that, in some ways, to the extent that AMLO and now Claudia Sheinbaum can carry out their full program, that it can also help link progressive people together on both sides of the border in a way that could also be dangerous to imperialism.
I think that's a great point. And I think this is a particular situation because there really is a transnational working class here, right? Not only the 126 million Mexicans, but the 37 million Mexicans of, first, second, and third generation living and working and being involved in labor issues and strike issues in the United States. And the threat of a good example is right there, right? What the U.S. Corporate class clearly wants is a judiciary that's in their pockets, right? If you just go to any mining, excavation site in anywhere of Latin America, and you can see the devastation that it causes, right? Between, in this case, U.S. and Canadian interests, right? So combined with a judicial reform in which the public elects their judges, combined with the ban on, open pit mining, and combined with that indigenous reform, which is not getting as much press, and actually it's good that it's not, so it can kind of go through, right? Which would provide greater indigenous and Afro-Mexican autonomy to decide what projects can and can't go on their territories. And that affects things like mining issues, that affects things like energy issues, and that affects things like water issues, which are going to be increasingly, more and more important in a world of climate change, where water is going to be ever more of a scarce resource, right? So if they don't have the judiciary in their pocket, it's not going to be as easy for them. Of course, they never tell you that. What they say is it's going to undermine judicial independence. It's actually going to do the exact opposite. It's going to give people a greater say in, who are the people who make these vital decisions. So you can't have multinationals coming in and putting in injunctions hours after a law is passed and suspending what, the Congress voted on. And I think that's really, really important. And one other final thing on this is it's also going to go after the excessive salaries and the excessive perks that the federal judiciary here live with. I mean, they make really stratospheric salaries. They have, they have drivers, they have vacations, they have all kinds of benefits. So it's a really kind of an in-your-face kind of excessive lifestyle, right? And as AMLO has repeatedly said, you can't have a rich government with a poor people, right? And that resonates with people. Why should we have a gilded class of judges that have everything, right? When, there are people who at times in Mexico are in jail for years because they can't post bail before even coming to trial. And many of them are indigenous people who don't even speak Spanish and have no access to a translator. That's one of the other tenets in this reform. So the idea is to actually create a justice system that is at least somewhat closer to the people. And that would be really a terrible example for people who don't want that spreading to other countries.
Well, as always, Kurt, you're on top of it all, and we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks very much. A pleasure.
Rania?
I do support the idea of countries in the global South holding press conferences for their leadership to comment on internal American matters. I like that he suggested that. I love that idea. I think countries should start doing it because you know what? It's insane. It actually is insane when you think about it that way. The fact that U.S. leadership sits there and comments on these internal matters that, of course, affects the profit of U.S. companies. And we would just find it completely absurd if, for example, like Iranian leaders, or like suddenly started holding press conferences to be like, we feel this way about HR 732, in Congress. And anyway, I think that's a fantastic move. And if any leaders of those countries are listening, please hold some press conferences.
Well, maybe they are.
Comment.
At the cultural annex of the Mexican embassy in Washington, D.C., they have a great statue of Pancho Villa. Would be fantastic to have someone give that kind of press conference right next to that. statue would really say what it needs to. If you ever, anyone watching here, if you ever go to Mexico City, have a chance to look around at different things, you should go to the Museum of Interventions. The Museum of Interventions in Mexico City. It's all about U.S. interventions into Mexico, and it's like nothing you've ever heard in school. I'll tell you that about the so-called Mexican-American War and Pancho Villa and all of that. Really, really interesting and fantastic if you have the chance to travel there. So, yeah, interesting points all around, Rania. Before we get to our next guest, I just wanted to turn our attention here to maybe cleaning up some things as it concerns the Democratic National Convention. Obviously, we were live in conjunction with Free Speech TV on Wednesday and Thursday prior to the convention. And thanks again to all of our guests and everyone at Free Speech TV that made that possible. But, now here we are. Convention season is closed. The campaign is on full force. There's a lot that can be said about this. I don't have any questions for you, Rania, but I don't know if there's anything that you're sitting with in the wake of the Democratic National Convention now that we've entered into campaign season, as it were.
Well, look, the convention for me, I thought it was really interesting to see the juxtaposition of how it was covered or the attention it got online versus how it was covered in the corporate media. Because obviously there is something we talked about a lot last week was the fact that they wouldn't let a Palestinian speak, even just to endorse Kamala Harris with the whole uncommitted movement. I know we're going to get into that with one of our guests that's coming shortly after this conversation. But all that's to say, I think I understand why the Democratic Party leadership decided not to let a Palestinian speak, because while it was definitely a huge trending issue on Twitter and on Instagram and on TikTok, if you watch the corporate media, that wasn't what they were talking about. The corporate media barely talked about Palestine or Gaza. They talked about the various celebrities that were performing, the musicians that were supporting, the various speeches that were given, the really superficial sort of like surface level PR gimmicks of like Demure and Brat. And, I can't even. But that was the coverage. That was the coverage it was getting on CNN, because I was perusing, and on the New York Times and the Washington Post, the stuff that was happening around Gaza. It's really become this like background noise. And I think it was quite upsetting because, there is a genocide taking place. We cover it on this show and on all of our programs constantly, and we're not going to stop doing that. But it's just, it really leads to disillusionment when you see how there's so many people who, despite the fact that 80% of people who are like the base of this party support not just a ceasefire, but withholding weapons to Israel to stop this from happening. It's like in our social media feeds every day. And then these very decadently dressed officials can get on a stage and act like it's not happening, while the people in attendance at this convention were like mocking protesters as they were saying the names of those who've been killed in Gaza. And then you had someone like Malcolm Nance going on Twitter celebrating the fact that Kamala Harris defeated the pro-Palestinians, as he called them. The attitude was just so disgusting, Eugene. And then you had Kamala Harris get up and give this speech where she's bragging that we already do have the most lethal military force in the world. I guess I'm just kind of rambling now, but it's just really upsetting to see that this is what we have as leadership in this country, is just these monsters who make jokes, who mock, who, are wearing like tens of thousands of dollars in designer earrings and clothing while they carry out a genocide without any care in the world.
Yeah, I think there's so many things that can be said. The thing I guess that's sitting with me now several days later is just how poorly covered the actual policy positions are by the mainstream media. To some degree, the mainstream media is making all these, or not the mainstream media, people are making all these critiques about Kamala Harris not giving any interviews. I guess she is going to do one with Tim Walz, I think, this week or at some different point. But, what's the point of a lot of these interviews? Because they never really get to the heart of the matter. Obviously people in the United States, the biggest issue is inflation, the economy, the amount of money that people are having to pay towards just basic goods and services, the fact that over 140 million people in this country are having at least a little difficulty making ends meet week to week, that 25 million people basically every single week are at least some of the days out of the week going hungry. 25 million people. All these different things are obviously such a key fact. And all you hear reported about Kamala Harris is, well, she says she's going to address grocery prices, blah, blah, blah. And the mainstream media actually like builds into what the Republicans say, that these are like crazy communist price controls. Why you wouldn't want to have price controls on basic things like food, shelter, clothing is a whole other issue. But like they essentially kind of co-sign the idea that this is some sort of like radical left-wing program. But when you really start to dig into it, it's like very little. I'll give the Associated Press credit for the grocery prices thing, because they did a fact checker on it and said it would have no impact whatsoever on grocery prices because they are not price controls or price caps. In fact, all Kamala Harris, the details she's giving us in terms of grocery prices is that it'll basically, if she has her way, it would make it easier for the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to investigate and then sue individual companies for an undefined amount of price gouging, which then would go to the courts. These companies could, of course, adjudicate it, so that maybe at some point, sometime, dare in the future, that one company, and maybe even that one good by that one company, that the prices would come down. So that's like not actually that significant. A number of states actually already have, I think over 20 states have laws that are just like this. And as we can see over the past 3 years, those did very little except for a brief period during the pandemic to hold prices down. And then other than that, she's saying, I'm going to continue what we've been doing under the Biden-Harris administration, which of course has not kept prices down. They've in fact skyrocketed. Or the issue of housing. She's talking a lot about housing. It's a huge crisis. She said she wants to build 3 million homes by the end of her 4 years. They keep repeating that. Well, I mean, the crisis is so big, we don't even know how bad it is. But, you know, based on the estimates I've been able to find, we need between 4.3 and 7.3 million rental homes. So again, not even coming close to meeting the scale of the crisis. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, who's even eligible for some of these programs she's suggesting? Because the $25,000 for first-time home buyers, you have to have paid your rent on time for 2 years to be eligible. Now, that to some people that may actually sound reasonable, but I think to people who actually understand the hurdles that are faced by first-time home buyers, who are almost always people coming from low-income backgrounds and at best sort of modest income backgrounds, I'm sure there's a lot of people who maybe in the last year got their finances together to be able to have a home, but in the year before that were like everyone else struggling, and maybe they paid their rent on the 7th instead of by the 5th, which is usually, you know, when you get docked by your landlord in the United States, but some people it's right away, but they still paid, but they would actually be ineligible if for 1 month they actually did not pay on time. Not did you get evicted. So you could actually have paid and the landlord could have charged you the late fee and you would not actually be eligible for the $25,000. So in fact, you know, I think that you're going to see that these sort of, one, it won't do as much as it said, but that it actually, the people who need that assistance the absolute most are going to be the ones who are like, you know, if you paid your rent on time for 2 years, if you have great credit, if you have all those other things, there are a lot of low-income homebuyer programs that you can speak to, but the people who really need the most help at the bottom up could be excluded. I haven't actually really seen that in one article. I had to go to a specialist housing site to actually find that information, but it makes a huge difference in terms of how it would impact, especially the Black community, which it's allegedly pitched towards in terms of how it's going. So it just shows how the media honestly is included in this. And I'll, you know, name some names. Jeff Stein at the Washington Post. And, you know, Jeff, if you're watching, you know, I like Jeff. You know, he's a nice person. He writes a lot about good economic issues. Yeah. But he wrote this whole article in the Washington Post about how this is the transformative economic program of Kamala Harris when it is not, in fact, transformative. You know, you don't have anyone actually talking about the scale of the problem. And so how can people make an informed choice? And I'll just stop there. How can you make an informed choice in the election if you got 2 kids, you're running around, you're trying to make ends meet, you just want to read the news real quick to try to figure out what's going on so you're not ignorant, and you read Kamala Harris, transformative change, $25,000 for first-time home buyers. She's going to keep down grocery prices, blah, 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 blah. Well, that price sounds great. And then you're going to vote, and then you're going to be like, well, wait a second. I thought this was supposed to happen. And so you got to blame the Democrats. You got to blame the Republicans, of course, for lying to people about what they're going to do. But to me, you got to blame the media that doesn't want to look beyond the sort of corporate centrist business roundtable approach to the world, which they have. And the Business Roundtable is the biggest lobbyist for all Fortune 500 companies, where anything that is like, you know, to the left of, I don't even know, like if it's to the left of Joe Manchin, it's some radical left-wing program.
I mean, Eugene, it's just such a joke. And then the other thing too is the way that the media covers up the fact that you actually do have more choices depending on which state you're in than these two candidates than Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Like, but you wouldn't know if you watched CNN or the New York Times that there are several third-party candidates running. I mean, I'm not a big fan of all of them, but a lot of them have way better policy positions or just policy positions in general compared to these two parties that are shoved down our throats. Like, we really don't live in a democracy. I don't know how anyone can sit there and say with a straight face that we do when we have these two corporate candidates who have either similar or the same policies, or if they're different, like it's really, really, really superficial and doesn't speak to the things that people care about and need the most. I mean, it's mind boggling. And then the other thing about the DNC I'll say is that it was amazing to see these like sort of intelligence military people speaking, like Leon Panetta. Oh my God.
Amazing. Quoting Ronald Reagan.
I mean, at the Democratic National Convention, they let all these Republicans speak on stage, like who are like not going to vote for Trump, are going to vote for Kamala. And I'm just like, yeah, Anna Navarro, like literally the child of a Contra.
Yeah.
Who
talking about how Kamala's
lie
great because she loves her dog.
I mean, it's just, you can't like the jokes write themselves. Honestly, the jokes write themselves. And it feels like such an insult to our intelligence to have had to endure all of that. And then, after all was said and done, it's just like, once again, genocide continues. It continues, Eugene. And, I feel very
with US support.
emotional.
Don't forget
about
they
this.
sent the $20 billion in weapons during the convention.
It couldn't happen without U.S. support, but I'm sitting here watching this from Lebanon, right? Like, and I just see all these America First liberals who are like, yeah, I know that the genocide's happening and that really sucks, but like Democrats are better for most Americans. So sorry. And it's like, I mean, is that true? Whatever. Both parties really suck, but you're really going to write off the rest of the world? Like, that's essentially what AOC said. She said in an interview, she was like, she had this whole word salad when she was asked directly about the elephant in the room, about the fact that like the Democrats are so horrific on Palestine. And she was like, yeah, but like, trans kids. And I'm like, what? Okay. Like, Republicans are really much worse than Democrats on trans kids, but like, why are you deflecting from a genocide? And I'm sitting here in a country that,
level issue, not really a federal issue, but anyway.
Right. But also, I'm sitting here in a country full of people that live next to Israel, which is bombing Lebanon every single day. And it's under Kamala Harris and Joe Biden that this is happening. And I just like don't understand how anyone in the world is supposed to get excited about this woman just because some Democrats in America want to go back to brunch.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good point. And the thing is, and we can get into this more later, it's not a single issue. I mean, beyond anything else, we're sending them billions of dollars, first and foremost, which we could be using to build up our own communities here. But I mean, there is a moral element to this in terms of like, who do you really want to be? Do you want to be the person that's trying to pit trans kids against Palestinians? Do you want to be the person that's trying to pit unions against Palestinians? Like, this is really, it's not a zero-sum game here. You can actually be against the genocide and be for all these other things. And in fact, of all these people who claim that they care so much about Palestine, like AOC, we're actually like, yeah, we won't vote for Harris until we get X, Y, and Z. You might get some movement on the issue, but you're never going to get any movement on the issue if you just capitulate ahead of time. And there's so many historical examples that we could talk about that we don't have time to go into here. Maybe we just need to do a whole show about it. But the reality is none of that matters to these people. I mean, listen, you're from the DC area, Rania. You see how much money is generated by this machine on a regular basis. I mean, this is, you hate to be cynical, and we'll move to the next guest on this, but I lived there for 15 years in DC, and the reality is these people who run these two major parties and the media buyers and the consultants and all these people, it's all one big business for them, and they don't want anything to change because they want to have access not to power. They actually have no power. Billionaires have power because they pay for everything, but they want to have access to influence to shape how it looks when they have the billionaire agenda. They know they can't go outside the billionaire agenda, but inside the billionaire agenda, they have a lot of influence to shape how it looks, which which makes them feel powerful, even though they are in fact powerless. And these people are desperate to maintain control of these positions that give them some sense of worth and meaning, no matter who it hurts, no matter what country it destroys, and no matter what planet it destroys, because we're seeing that with climate change. So it's really disgusting, and I don't know how you really can excuse that. But we'll come back to that in a couple guests. But we want to turn to another important issue, one that was somewhat on display at the Democratic National Convention and also the Republican National Convention. That is labor rights in the United States of America and the ongoing struggle of trade unionists to improve their lot. We are very, very honored to be joined here by Hussein Karimi, who is a labor journalist with On the Line, a labor video and other forms of media publication. Hussein, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. I mentioned the Republican National Convention in labor. Of course, the Teamsters president was there. Some big news recently regarding the Teamsters and some of their organizing at Amazon. 280,000, I think, workers are now able to join a union. Now, it's one of those wonky issues, Hussein, that for the average people may not, make a lot of sense. So let's try to get into this. What took place here? I know that there's independent contractors, employees, or whatever, and what is its significance in terms of what took place with this decision?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, there are something like 275,000 Amazon delivery drivers that are employed not directly through Amazon, but something that Amazon calls delivery service partners, or DSPs. There are thousands of them that make up the Amazon delivery driver network across the country. They employ 275,000 drivers that allow all of us who use Amazon to get packages almost instantaneously, right, on a one-day turnaround. These drivers in Palmdale, California, just last year in April of 2023, 84 of them organized a union, won their election, negotiated a contract with the local DSP that they were employed through, and Amazon terminated the entire unit. They went on strike in June of 2023 based on the argument that this is a gross violation of federal labor law, arguing that Amazon is a joint employer of all these drivers. And if you go onto the Amazon website and apply to become a DSP, Amazon basically says, if you have $10,000 in cash, we'll be able to provide you with the cars, with the equipment, with payroll, with gear, with devices, everything you need to set up a DSP we'll give to you, so long as you take responsibility for the employees. They're not our employees. We're going to give you all the materials to set up your business, and now they're your employees. This decision by the labor board, specifically around the drivers in Palmdale, California, who have been on strike for over a year, sets a really important precedent for the ability of 275,000 Amazon drivers to organize across the country, which is that they are, in fact, employees of Amazon.
Well, so what does this mean in terms of moving forward? Like, how does that benefit, to be considered? You think it would be self-explanatory, but to be considered employees of Amazon, what does Amazon then have to do? And also, I think it's always important to recognize that how does a decision like this benefit workers that work for other major companies in the same capacity?
Yeah, I think at the core of it, it means that Amazon has more of a legal duty to recognize and bargain with the Teamsters. Where Amazon drivers do organize at their DSP, now Amazon is legally responsible for the bargaining unit or the group of workers that now constitute the union. In the case of the drivers in Palmdale, Amazon, before this ruling, said, well, they're not our employees. The termination of the contract with that specific DSP has nothing to do with the fact that they organized a union. Obviously, that's total BS. This changes the calculation now for the Teamsters and sets a precedent for all other drivers who are organizing with the Teamsters, including 4 drivers at 4 DSPs in Skokie, Illinois, who are also on strike. As far as other companies, FedEx is a big example of this, where drivers are employed through subcontractors. UPS has drivers who use their own cars. Amazon also has that too, through Amazon Flex. So you can sign up for a block of time on an app and say, I'm going to deliver 100 packages for 4 hours. You may or may not deliver all the packages. You're an independent contractor according to Amazon, which means you don't actually have the right to organize at all because you work for yourself. So that independent contractor issue hasn't been fully resolved, but those drivers who are subcontracted through these local DSPs now do have more of ability to organize. And the Teamsters, of course, are putting a lot of resources behind their campaign.
No, I think it's an important point and a good point. I mean, and I think to your point, Rania, I mean, it essentially means that Amazon doesn't have to pay them, doesn't have to give them benefits, doesn't have to do anything else. And now they have the ability to connect with this. And it feels, I mean, this is one of the biggest issues in labor, Hussein, as you know very well, because it also is a big issue vis-a-vis the fight for 15. McDonald's, other people sort of saying the same thing. And notably, Kamala Harris, one of her top advisors, her brother-in-law, Tony West, the general counsel of Uber, this has been his main legal fight with Uber to make sure that drivers are considered independent contractors. So it feels like moving into 2025, this is one of the biggest things that companies are trying to use in this era to stop what is, sort of a historic popularity of unions right now.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the reality for 16% of the U.S. workforce who work in the gig economy. It's informal. If you're an Uber driver, if you work for one of these DSPs, if you're Amazon Flex driver, if you're a FedEx driver, you basically, who's your target? Is it a local company? I mean, Amazon, even though in the case of Palmdale, your target is this DSP that decided, okay, we'll sit down and negotiate a contract with you, and Amazon says, well, no. You're not Amazon drivers. We'll just cut the entire contract. Like you said, Eugene, it makes it much harder to fight for healthcare, for instance, that is not up to par compared to UPS drivers who top out at $49 an hour and who have fully covered healthcare for their families, for themselves, who have pensions. That's not the reality for so many millions of workers, including those at Amazon, FedEx, and McDonald's, all the sort of franchisee models.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on, not to make everything about the Democratic Party, but I do think it's important because we are coming into an election year, and I think it's pretty clear where Republicans stand when it comes to anything involving expanding union rights or workers' rights. But I don't know. You can tell me if I'm wrong here. I don't know that Kamala Harris has expressed any sort of policy positions on this sort of thing, but I think it's safe to assume if she has not, that she would be continuing what has taken place under her boss, the president right now, Joe Biden, the administration she serves in. So how has Joe Biden been on these union issues? Has he, I know his rhetoric is quite pro-worker, but has his administration been helpful or useful in any way? And it's okay if they have, I actually do want to know, in terms of, expanding access to more benefits and workers' rights for people like this?
Well, I mean, I think the bar is low. Joe Biden is the first sitting U.S. president who apparently came to a picket line of workers in the 2023 strike of UAW workers and the various auto companies at GM, at Ford, at Stellantis. There are differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but I would say the difference is obliteration and a frontal assault on workers' rights and a death by 1,000 paper cuts. I mean, union density over the last several decades has been in decline, whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. I think one of the main sort of policy initiatives of the Democratic Party that they tout and promote to position themselves as the party for the American workers, the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, to pump billions of dollars through federal loans paid by U.S. taxpayers to build industry largely based in the South, but also in Middle America. One of the big sort of flagship victories that Biden touts is the reopening of the Belvidere assembly plant in Belvidere, Illinois, that was shuttered in 2022, along with dozens of other auto plants over the last several years. 1,400 jobs were cut. Over the course of the strike of UAW workers in 2023, they won a commitment from Stellantis to reopen that plant. And part of that victory was Biden committing $300 million in taxpayer money to Stellantis to reopen the plant, create new batteries, open a line for a new truck. That commitment has since been reneged by Stellantis. Stellantis is saying, well, wait, we got all this hundreds of millions of dollars, but we're not actually going to open the Belvidere assembly plant. In fact, we're going to lay off 2,000 workers at Warren Assembly Plant while we increase the pay of our CEO by 40%, Carlos Tavares. This is unfolding now, just in the last month. And the UAW is saying, well, if you're going to go back on your commitment that was part of the contract that we ratified, we have the right to strike over it across the country. And so we may just see in the next couple of months another major national auto strike. But I mean, this is I think the limitations of some of these so-called industrial policies of the Democrats, which really are war policies. They're not policies to bring back tens or hundreds of thousands of industrial jobs across the country. It's a policy that positions the U.S. to compete more favorably with China around EVs, around semiconductors. And speaking of semiconductors, Intel was also a recipient of the Chips and Science Act. They got $8 billion just earlier this year to create 10,000 new jobs in the United States. Earlier this month, they announced 15,000 cuts to jobs, which is 15% of their workforce. So the problem with these policies is that they have very weak regulation on the companies. Even though they're getting federal money, they're getting U.S. taxpayer money to create jobs, and the results of it, I mean, is certainly a mixed bag, but in the worst case is mass layoffs.
No, I think it's a great point. And I think, the best case scenario we saw from a combination of the IRA and the CHIPS Act was that manufacturing employment would be like 4% up, but that would still be less than 10% of the population. So it's like, who am I? But that doesn't sound like much of a renaissance, from my point of view, Hussein. And I just will ask you here to close on just a general point, because I do think that one of the things that's notable about, we've talked about the UAW, the Teamsters, and others. I mean, are you anticipating that the climate of continued labor militancy that the climate of this will continue moving forward here in the next year or so?
Well, I think so. I mean, union popularity in the United States is at its highest since 1965. Support amongst workers who are under the age of 30 is at a record high. 90% of workers under 30 support unions. In 2023, we saw major public contract fights at huge companies that inspired so many other sections of the workforce. When you see 350,000 UPS Teamsters, when you see 100,000 auto workers, when you see 140,000 Hollywood workers go on strike or prepare for a strike and win major victories against their companies, against the Goliaths of the world, that engenders a sense of optimism and hope. Walmart, for instance, or Amazon, or companies in similar industries. And I think what we've seen off the heels of those fights by big unions such as the UAW, such as the Teamsters, such as Unite Here and SEIU investing in new organizing, I think the hope of a new era for the labor movement is still very much alive, whether or not it is a Democratic Party president or a Republican in the office. I think the idea of class versus class struggle in the labor movement is certainly back, but it's not going to come easy regardless of who's in office.
Mm-hmm. No, great point, and great shot of you there. I think that was the Tennessee victory of UAW. Quite a bit of hope and elation. That was from On the Line, that B-roll, by the way, of which you are a journalist with, and we are very happy, Hussein, for you have been willing to give us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Nice to hear some good news amidst a lot of bad.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with you. Very
Sorry.
matter of fact.
I'm today's cynic. Yeah. Sorry.
I don't even know.
I don't
even know what you're doing over there. You look like you're putting like a seltzer, like one of those little seltzer tablets in a water or something.
No, there's okay. Just there, if you hear some noise, it's because there's like this cover on my light that I have to smooth it out a little bit, and the tape came off. And so when I wasn't on screen, I went to go try to slyly fix it, and then it fell off again. So now I'm getting more tape for the next time I'm not on screen to cover the lighting.
Listen, well, now that you've told everyone, you might as well just get up and do it right now. But listen, I think everyone, I'm glad to see that this is Rania Khalek following in the steps of what's his name? Home Improvement, the show. This is you now. You are
basically Tim Allen. Is that what you're saying? I mean, he's really right wing. I don't want to be Tim Allen, the actor in real life. Oof. He's like a Fox News guy, I think. I'm
Yeah.
not joking. It's actually pretty upsetting because I grew up watching that show.
No, come on. That was a
Anyway.
90s classic right there.
Yeah, it was.
Gen Z viewers totally lost right now, but nonetheless.
We're like, what has just happened?
Yeah.
Please don't turn us off.
Yeah. Well, yes, it is always good to hear some good news. Sorry, just waiting really quickly on some technical issues. I think we're just trying to work out here with our next guest, who we'll get to in a little bit. But no, I think it's a very good point. I'll also note on the issue that Hussein was raising about independent contractors, I raised the issue of Uber and Tony West, the brother-in-law of Kamala Harris, who was the attorney and was trying to prevent Uber drivers from being classified as employees. Tim Walz, the vice presidential nominee of Kamala Harris, same thing. There is a law that was passed in Minnesota that would have essentially classified them as such. Tim Walz was making a big point that they are quote unquote independent contractors and that they have to be classified in such a way and to keep them classified in such a way. So a little bit of synergy there between the vice president and the top advisor, Tony West, over this issue of independent contractors, which of course is completely ridiculous because Uber controls everything. But I think we do have our next guest here ready to go.
Well, can I make it before you invite the next guest? I just want to say something that we forgot to say earlier before I forget. I do want to thank that there are some people who've donated in the live chat, Eugene.
Great.
Steve McNeely donated and gave a fist up emoji. So fist right back up, Steve. And thank you for your very generous donation. And then Andrea Rosario Gabori donated as well and said, we are living in the real life Hunger Games. I couldn't agree more than especially with all the decadence we were talking about at the DNC. But I just also using that as a reminder that you can do a one-time donation in the live chat, you guys. And if you have a comment, I might read it out loud. All right, you take it away, Eugene.
Yeah, no, might read it out loud, so it better be good. Well, obviously, one of the critical issues for the entire globe is the ongoing genocide in Gaza. There's a lot of questions about how that may or may not affect the presidential election here in the United States, and we are very, very honored to be joined here by Dr. Hassan Abdul Salam, who is the director of the Abandon Harris campaign. Dr. Salam, thanks so much for being with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for all your work.
Well, listen, it's a pleasure to have you here. And I guess I'll just start with this. I mean, last week we saw the DNC with, the just total snub of the Palestinian people and anyone who cares about this issue of the genocide. I'm curious, you all Abandon Harris, you were there, you had a press conference, you were pushing different things. I mean, what has been the response you have seen to your call to deliver a vote against those perpetuating genocide in the wake of what we saw in the DNC?
Among communities of conscience, it's very clear that the sense is of elation, relief, that there's at least a voice and opportunity for all of us to take action at this critical moment where our country is engaging in one of the most vicious human rights violation in our history, the genocide, enabling it, this administration, and the bombings, the munitions that are raining upon people in Gaza. And so when we came out and we said very clearly that the only thing that we have now in our arsenal, our nonviolent arsenal, is to punish the vice president for enabling genocide in order for us to buy power such that it will be forever known that people of conscience came out, they walked gently to the ballot box, and they spoke the truth, and it led to the demise, the toppling of genocide. This administration should be known for what it is. It is despicable for us to even have this very conversation today, for us to contemplate the options in a democratic election for which this should never have been a choice. And so we feel committed, as we have begun with Mr. Biden in October. We declared that he would be someone we would never support. We actively began campaigning against him since November 1st when he didn't declare a permanent ceasefire. In July, we made a similar request to the vice president. We asked her to tell us what her policies were. We only wanted two: an unconditional ceasefire, permanent, and second, a full arms embargo. The media took our message to the campaign. They said no. We're not going to talk to you. And so extraordinary, the reaction that you could see after that, the vice president speaking to protesters who were screaming the song of justice, saying, "You will never hide from genocide." And she said, "I'm speaking." And we knew there and then we had no other option but to punish. And that's why on August 19th, we did so in Chicago, blocks away from the DNC convention. Because the real question, Madam Vice President, is when will the people of Gaza speak? When will people of conscience oppressed all around the world because of us? Their voices are completely silenced. When you had a moment to hear from young people, them talking on behalf of the voiceless, you shut them down because you felt that you had to continue with your speech that day. But for day after day, attack after attack, silence from this administration. Silence in the face of people who are shouting and dying to be heard. And so even if we're the only ones, and our people understand that that might be the case, the only movement, the only organization that abandons Harris, we will do it regardless of consequence. And we will win and we will defeat this administration because in the swing states, we believe we can actually ensure that this vice president doesn't win because of these vile attacks on an innocent people on the verge of disintegration.
Hassan, I'm curious if you could maybe explain to our audience or differentiate a bit, because I think it's a little bit confusing. And obviously there was some overlap between the uncommitted movement and what was initially the abandoned Biden movement that's now the abandoned Harris movement. But now that overlap, I guess, is kind of over after what happened at the Democratic Convention, or maybe even before that. So can you explain to our audience what is the difference between the uncommitted movement and then the idea of abandoned Harris?
So the critical difference that I would say between both is that we believe our leverage comes from punishing, ensuring the defeat of those who have violated the rights, the civil rights of innocent people. Whereas uncommitted believes in the continued negotiation, reconciliation with those in power. We've made it clear from the beginning, and that has been a difference that we've seen from October, from November. Even though we called on people to vote uncommitted in the primary, abandoned Biden called on people to vote uncommitted, we are not uncommitted in the sense that we believe very essential that the message to the political landscape will only come if there is a defeat on November 5th. Whereas folks in the uncommitted campaign, they believe that they could still leverage some type of concession from the Democratic Party, from the vice president, by continued interaction, engagement with the party. We were never welcome to the DNC. We don't get any donations from the Democratic Party. We're often attacked by the Democratic Party. We take a stance that we cannot in any way legitimize this party that's engaged in genocide. As a human rights professor, I could tell you that we feel that engagement with the party seeking concessions after it's been evident that they don't want to provide any support to the people of Gaza would be a road folly in its pursuit, because it would mean that if they were to win this election, they would have won despite the genocide. So what would happen afterwards if they're rewarded? Our parents and family and friends who are killed would be a precedent that could be set, and any oppression you can engage in with communities of conscience and still then say, you still have to vote for us. And so we feel very strongly, though we love the people in uncommitted, we know they're well-intentioned, we know that they are seeking the good of Gaza, we feel that the only way that we can win in this fight is if history writes that the Democratic Party at the presidential level lost, was defeated, was punished because of their unconscionable attacks on an innocent people.
No, I think, that it's a very important point, and I'm glad you raised the issue of people of conscience. And for those who saw your press conference, they won't be surprised. But I wanted you to just opine a little bit on, the diversity of Abandon Harris, because I think some people are trying to pigeonhole this as this is just a Muslim thing, this is just an Arab thing, which obviously a lot of Arab and Muslim people are speaking out. But there was a poll in March that 1 in 6 black voters were considering not voting as a form of protest, and that protecting Palestine was one of the top issues that was causing them to say that. So this is something that transcends, any one community in terms of those who want to deliver a message like what Abandon Harris is promoting.
People from all backgrounds, African American, Latino, Gen Z, people from all ages, religions, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, are part of the Abandon Biden and now Abandon Harris movement. We see and are guided by the light of Martin Luther King. We're here to say that this is an American movement that has people from all across the nation. It resonates. People don't want to side or be complicit with genocide. Our fathers and foremothers, the people who set the course for civil rights, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, John Lewis, they guide us and remind us that civil rights belong to all people, not just Americans. And so torture, genocide, displacement should not happen to anyone around the world. We are gratified by the attention by folks in our press conferences, in our protests, coming from all backgrounds. At our very press conference, we had Cornel West, we had Jill Stein, we had Claudia de la Cruz, and we believe that this mission is one that all Americans must participate in. Muslim Americans and Arab Americans are but a minority, and we have been inspired and want to be hand in hand with all people of conscience, and that anyone can participate. Libertarians, former Republicans, former Democrats, progressives, conservatives. We are not talking about a political policy, a question, an issue that differentiates Americans. We're talking genocide. This should be attracting 100% of our population from all across the nation. And so I'm here to tell you, please join us. Please come and teach us. Please hold our hands so we can, like people before us, sing the song that we shall overcome.
I want to ask you because, this is a question that I'm sure you get often because this is pretty much the line of defense when it comes to how Democrats respond to the idea of how, not voting for Kamala Harris, is how do you respond to the whole, well, you're basically getting Trump elected by doing this, which I think is a really insidious attack line. But nonetheless, it's one that we hear a lot. So how do you respond to that line of you are helping get Trump elected, and as a result, things are just going to turn out worse for Palestinians than they already are?
And the former president prevented our family and friends and colleagues from entering America, but the vice president killed them. Madam Vice President, you killed our people. You killed human beings. If it were the case that you committed some act that we could actually negotiate with, for example, you didn't pursue a specific policy that we have disagreements about on taxes or on some policy question about the degree and relative importance of infrastructure in particular states, well, those are technicalities. We could differ. But when you come to the value of life, this is a message to all Americans. There is no compromise. There's things we should never compromise on because otherwise we're all unsafe. We need to have a nation and a planet that's safe. And so what we say is when you commit genocide, our only option is to send a clear signal that it's intolerable. And so the president and now the former president that you refer to, at Abandon Biden and now Abandon Harris, we say 4 years under any Republican is incomparable to 1 day in Gaza. That we understand fully that this struggle continues, but that we must, in our first step, punish genocide here on November 5th, and then continue with our fellow Americans all across the planet and here in the United States in the struggle against Trump. We believe all the two candidates at the top of the ticket here, Mr. Trump and the vice president, who really represent a single ticket, are despicable candidates. An oligopoly, a bargain, that when people say you'll bring the other, curious how they say that. They seem to describe the reality of a difference without a distinction when it comes to genocide. We will fight them all, and our first step is those who began the genocide for us to send a clear signal. And maybe I should share a personal story. I was imprisoned and tortured in Jerusalem when doing research on the occupation with youth. And in prison, I still recall the feeling of utter loneliness, the clanking through the two metallic doors, my heart rate increasing, not knowing what will happen. The interrogation, why did you come here? Because we put a message on YouTube in Arabic calling for the liberation of Palestine. And we had all these youth, and they would tell us, Amran here, one of the youth with us, is behind these doors, and Sheikh Sami is behind these doors to humiliate me. One person said that they put bleach on themselves every night because they talk to scum like me. I was utterly destroyed internally. And all I wanted was for people to speak for me. I dreamed a dream that in America, people were calling for my release. And when I finally came back, my second trauma, unparalleled, the trauma of loneliness. No one knew about my story. The American government didn't try to seek my release. And so what we are doing here, if history writes that this happened, that people of conscience, despite the sacrifice of only 4 years, where we survived the former president, but that we came out for a people so innocent who will suffer bombings that will continue after the election of the vice president, that we came out and ensured that she was defeated, and it will be written that was because of the genocide, and that people did it in spite of the fact that they knew and they hated the other option. So this is a moment of glory and courage, a moment, a destiny, November 5th, for all of history, for people to know that even when it came to sacrificing, Trump is a sacrifice, no doubt, a despicable candidate, a man who will rule with impunity, but with constraints within America because of our Supreme Court and our Congress. He will never bomb us and maim us and destroy us in the way that Netanyahu, with the support of the vice president, is doing currently in Gaza and now today in the last few days in the West Bank. The genocide is spreading because people believe around the world that they can get away with it. And so, my fellow Americans, do not be deceived by the rhetoric, the doublespeak that tells you there's a lesser evil when it comes to genocide. And go out for the people who are voiceless. When I was in prison in this mock justice, I met one of the youth as they were taking me to the courts behind bars, handcuffed on my hands, my feet as they processed me. And he asked me a question. He said, what would I do if I would go back to America? And I quickly said I'd speak out, even though the interrogators kept saying, I'll stay here forever. And the most amazing thing appeared on his face, a huge, brilliant smile. Despite being tortured, early 20s, married, worried about his family, what brought him pleasure is that right now, everyone here would hear his story. That all he wanted was not the bombs to end, or for people to learn now, finally, that the occupation has come to an end, which it must. But rather, his smile came because people of conscience were telling his story and acting. And the greatest action you can do that has implications is to vote. Vote against genocide.
Well, we thank you so much, Dr. Hassan Abdul Salam, director of the Abandon Harris campaign. It was our honor to have you here with us. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time.
Pleasure. Take good care.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, Eugene, I can't think of a better way to treat Democrats who've overseen a genocide than to try to use some leverage to get them to end it.
I'm with you on that 100%. 100%. Well, we want to turn to another critical story here, critical issue as we close out the show, and that is Sudan, where the conflict continues to rage on and many millions of people facing very dire circumstances. And we are very, very happy to be joined here once again by Mossab Baba, who is a researcher on Sudan. Mossab, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you guys.
No, well, it is our pleasure, and I guess I want to start here with a question that is, something that I've been seeing more and more in terms of how we frame the conflict. Amongst those who are all working very hard and desperate to see the conflict end, is what it's really about. I mean, obviously there's sort of a framing that it's just two generals fighting one another, but I've seen sort of increasingly some pushback on that from some individuals who feel that the army, the SAF is perhaps preferable to the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, who many people are also saying is backed by UAE, and so on and so forth. And I just wonder how you understand that framing, as it were, because it seems to be gaining sort of greater purchase hold in terms of how the conflict's being discussed in a general sense amongst those who want to see, peace as soon as possible.
Right. So this is kind of, in a way, it's been one of the reasons why the conflict has been going on this long without any, resolution to it, is that technically the army, SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, they should be the legitimate, armed forces in the country, and defend against militias or, especially something like the RSF, the Janjaweed. But the history of SAF tells a different story. Most of the people who are very, gung ho about, supporting SAF and stuff, they either haven't been really paying attention to what SAF has been doing since the 80s. I mean, this is not something new, but, or they've been just, kind of far away from what SAF was doing. So it's kind of, there's a few reasons why, like, citizens would be there. But the main reason is that the RSF has been on a rampage and just ransacking entire cities. I mean, Sudan is the only country on the continent right now where the capital has completely been destroyed and has fallen to the control of the RSF. So it's a very traumatic thing. It's a gruesome war. 10 million people displaced. You have almost 30 million in need of humanitarian aid. That's damn near the whole population of the country. So people who aren't familiar with how SAF has been moving within the past couple of decades are going to have that blind spot of, well, yeah, of course, it's the army and we have to support the army and there's no other chance but to support the army. But the army has been in bed with the RSF, for 10 years now. And the 10 years before it, since 2003, the army and the national intelligence are the ones that armed the RSF and created its autonomy. And Bashir was actually calling them like my protection, MIT. So it was, it's understandable why there are a lot of people who are saying, no, we should just support the Sudan Armed Forces. But it's not justified given the track record. Even if you look at it from the transitional period, starting in 2019, RSF has been, given major SAF garrisons, even in Khartoum, as a way to appease them and creating a business empire where they're, almost monopolizing certain sectors of the economy, like the gold mining industry, the livestock industry, which are two of the biggest economic industries in Sudan, have been given to the RSF. And this is all under the supervision of SAF. There is another more sinister kind of, motivation, which is basically the NCP, which is Bashir's previous regime. And they have a very strong influence and chokehold over SAF. Since the 80s, they've been clearing out the ranks of SAF from, independent or moderate or leftist, military officers, and they've been replacing them with NCP loyalists, which are pretty much like Sudan's version of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's been a saga of genocides and ethnic cleansings and, corruption since then. So the RSF is only the latest chapter. And that's what makes it complicated. Most citizens want just a simple solution. No, we just support SAF and SAF will take care of the RSF, without paying attention to the intricate details of how did RSF even get to this point. So while I understand why a lot of people are saying that, we support SAF, you also have some people who say that, RSF is fighting against the NCP, which has been in power since the 80s. So it's the only force that can actually face them and take them out. But, do you replace SAF with a militia, the RSF militia? So, but overwhelmingly, the majority of people in Sudan are more inclined to support SAF. And because there's another part to it, the RSF is a very ethno-supremacist movement. It believes that, the kind of quasi-Arab tribes from the West have been the main fighting force for Khartoum, so they deserve to take over Khartoum. But SAF is a lot more diverse in the lower ranks. Once you go to the higher ranks, there is also that kind of ethnic superiority. It shows in the higher ranks of SAF, and we kept kind of the Pan-African view of this war is that these are two ethno-supremacist outfits that are fighting each other, which was kind of the genesis of the Bashir regime. Keeping indigenous groups away from power and campaigns of genocide. We saw that in South Sudan, in the Nuba Mountains, in Darfur, in all of these places, in Blue Nile. We've seen how hundreds of thousands have been killed, for rising up and trying to liberate the land. So there's a pattern over there that's been kind of out of sight and out of mind for the average person who lives in the center of Sudan or the north. And they frankly didn't see that, those campaigns were against them as populations. As long as it's another population, it's out of sight, out of mind. So that's kind of the reasoning why you see a lot of people, supporting the Sudan Armed Forces. But I'll go back again, just real quick, just to say that if you want to take one commonality between these two outfits, they are both part of the normalization, the Israel, coalition in the Middle East. SAF is pretty much, more or less controlled by Cairo, where the RSF is more controlled by Abu Dhabi. And we know how both of these countries have been moving since 2014 and, starting the war with Yemen and helping to destabilize Libya. And so the actors themselves that are controlling both of these forces are the same axis that has been, causing a lot of destruction and a lot of suffering in the whole region. It's not just Sudan. Even in the Sahel right now, you see the AES countries, the Sahel countries, they, Burkina Faso and Niger and everything, they're looking at the UAE as one of the countries that have been supporting the militias in the northern regions of these countries. If you go to Ethiopia, you'll see that, the UAE is trying to get closer to Addis and, support them in their war effort, against the TPLF and everything, while the TPLF is more supported by Egypt. And the thing that makes this even more of a tragedy, Egypt and the UAE are in business together. They're always in talks together. So it's not like they're enemies and this is like a pure proxy war. It's almost like, betting on different horses within Sudan, and whatever happens to the Sudanese people is kind of not their concern, and they both have heavy economic interests with both of these entities.
I'm curious, and I'm so sorry. It's just the theme of our show today is the Democrats and the upcoming election. So, but I think it's an important thing to ask in that context, because what the U.S. decides to do around any war matters. Is there any difference at all between the two parties and what happens in Sudan? It doesn't really seem like it, but you can tell me if I'm wrong on that or explain if we've heard anything. I mean, Sudan's really been just kind of left out of any conversation in U.S. politics.
Yeah, so it's a bit complicated because there's not a big difference between what Democrats will do and what Republicans will do, especially after 2014. After kind of empowering UAE and Saudi and Egypt to be military powers and to kind of be a center of power in their own right. It's kind of like the U.S. security policy has been to give them the control over Sudan policy. So it's almost like the U.S. can't really do anything unless it goes to Cairo, Abu Dhabi, or Riyadh, and consults them. Like even U.S. representatives would go there before they go to Khartoum. Even before the war. So there's very little leverage for the U.S. to actually do anything in Sudan short of moving on it militarily. But the way Kamala Harris was speaking at the convention that we are going to target Iran, the terrorist country, and we're going to create the most lethal military force and stuff like that. It's not promising. It's not promising at all. And when you look at the Trump side, you're seeing that, the Abraham Accords were one of the main things, the only kind of, engagement, like active engagement the U.S. had with the transitional government was like, hey, we'll lift these sanctions, but you have to normalize with Israel. You have to hop on board with these Abraham Accords and everything. So the Trump administration has kind of had the upper hand in like the leading to the destabilization of Sudan right now. But Biden wasn't any better. Like the way the Biden administration has dealt with the Sudan issue, it's also been, how do you appease these both sides? And, inherently, how do you appease, Egypt and the UAE? So I don't, we don't hold our breath for anything, but it is a question to ask, like, Harris is vice president right now. What is she doing about the biggest humanitarian disaster on the planet right now? With these millions of people displaced, and we have a famine like that. Forget about the political side of it, just the humanitarian side of it. What are you doing? You're in office right now. So what exactly are you doing to address this issue? So, and it's never discussed in any, policy or any of the sound bites we're hearing or any of that. So I wish I had a definite answer for you, other than maybe the Green Party as far as, rolling back the military empire and stuff like that. But, a lot of times we have to, just look at this and kind of take it one step at a time and trying to see kind of where these policies are going to go. So we're waiting for both camps to actually say anything about Sudan or have some kind of breakthrough. But ultimately, the solution does lie within the regional politics. So the African Union, the IGAD, they have to step up and have to bring in the neighboring countries into this and somehow find a way, because that's the only solution. Like any kind of dependency on the US or these Arab countries or the EU is just more of the same. It's going to be a waste of time, and it's going to be more of a neo-colonial look at Sudan, victimizing people and how to bring in aid and stuff like that, but not addressing like the root problems. And these root problems can only be looked at when you start dealing with South Sudan and Chad and Ethiopia and these countries to kind of, come into the fold of this, solving this issue of the war. But more importantly, also, a lot of the actors from the December kind of youth activists, the liberation movements around Sudan, these are the people that have an intrinsic interest in seeing that fundamental change and stopping the war in a way that's just and that in a way that actually satisfies what the ambitions of like the Sudanese public.
Well, a lot to watch and a lot to continue to talk about, and we will continue to do both of those things. And certainly we are greatly helped by having you alongside us, Musab Baba, researcher on Sudan. Thank you so much for some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you both. Really appreciate it.
Well, Eugene, we went
Rania?
around the world today.
Around the world, as always, some bad, some good, but we'll just have to keep looking and keep pressing. And I think as it concerns Sudan, it would be very good to have some clarity here. But yeah, I think Musab is correct. They would rather not talk about it. The special envoy, Tom Perriello, of course, is very low ranking, quite frankly, reports to the State Department, not directly to the president. So it's just a sign that it's a side issue for them on multiple different levels. But yes, we went around the world. We said a lot. We did a lot. Big thanks to all of our guests, of course, as always. Rania, anything you want to leave our viewers with before we end the show today?
Yeah, I want to thank, we did have one more donation.
Oh, great.
So I want to just give a shout out to Mark McCook. Thank you for
Mark.
the donation. And on that note, I want to remind everyone, we are an independent media outlet. We don't have, Time Warner, or whatever else funds, all the 5 companies that fund 90% of American media. We don't have that funding.
No.
So to sustain ourselves and to grow, we need your support. If you are able, please consider becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can, as a member, access exclusive content as well as some exclusive merch, but most importantly, help fund independent media that is bringing you voices from the movement, from the ground, bringing you the reality of what's happening. And, I just want to say, Eugene, real quick, that, the power of independent media is huge. My trajectory of my life changed because I accidentally stumbled upon an independent media outlet before I became a journalist. And it literally was like, I went down a rabbit hole because I was like, wow, I'm being lied to about everything. So independent media can change lives. It can help spearhead or ignite change and movements in amazing, incredible ways. And it can be a part of movements. And I mean, it's just so incredibly powerful. And I mean that really from the heart. So again, if you are able, become a member, go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and literally change the trajectory of some people's lives by helping us inform them.
Well, hey, that's a great note to end on, and I think an important, hopeful note. And shout out to all our existing patrons and those who will become patrons after hearing Rania's great points there. Well, that is going to do it for us this week on the Freedom Side here on Breakthrough News. We will be back with you, of course, next time. For myself, for Rania, we will see you then.